Today we are looking at a case from the middle of the 19th century, so sit back as we go to New Zealand. Joseph Burns was born in Liverpool, England, in the year 1805, into an Irish family that had migrated to the bustling city in search of better opportunities. The economic landscape of Ireland during this period was primarily agrarian, characterised by low wages, harsh living conditions, and unjust land ownership practices, which drove numerous rural inhabitants to seek refuge elsewhere. The plight of tenant farmers in Ireland was worsened by land disposition, leading to resistance and resentment against oppressive landlords. Additionally, political unrest during events like the 1798 rebellion and the Act of the Union in 1801 heightened discord. Discriminatory laws against Catholics further exacerbated religious strife, prompting many to seek religious freedoms and equality in other countries. The journey undertaken by the parents of Joseph mirrored that of many Irish immigrants who crossed the sea, seeking improved economic prospects during a time of hardship in Ireland. At the time of his birth, Liverpool was a thriving port city, bustling with trade. Ships crowded the docks, loading and unloading goods, showcasing the city's importance in global commerce. However, many of the workers lived in very poor conditions, which highlighted the complexities of urban life in the early 19th century. Joseph had a very basic education. In 1810, schools for the working class in England were limited and often insufficient. Children from poor families had little access to formal schooling due to financial constraints and societal expectations. While charity schools aimed to provide some education, they were few in number and typically focused on rudimentary literacy and religious instruction rather than comprehensive learning. As a result, literacy and numeracy rates remained low among the poor, resulting in a significant portion of the population unable to read and write proficiently. Children from poor families often started working at a very young age, as they were expected to contribute to the family's income. Joseph started to work as soon as he was able, and from about the age of 12, secured an apprenticeship as a carpenter. In 1825, he joined the Navy, where he had to undertake arduous tasks and was often exposed to harsh weather conditions. However, within this disciplined environment, he underwent rigorous training and adhered to stringent regulations enforced by officers. In July 1840, he was stationed on the ship HMS Buffalo, which journeyed to Bay of Islands in New Zealand. The Bay of Islands held strategic significance as a key trading post and a site of early European settlement. It was a hub for whaling, fishing and the timber trade, attracting missionaries and settlers from around the world. Like all the crew of HMS Buffalo, Joseph appeared to be enjoying his time there. However, on the 28th of July 1840, a violent storm struck the area, and while anchored in Mercury Bay and laden with cargo, the ship was wrecked. The fierce gale-force winds severed her cables, leaving the crew powerless to prevent her fate. With no alternative left, the decision was made to intentionally run the ship aground. Fortunately, the majority of the crew managed to escape unharmed, although tragically, 2 died, and the vessel itself suffered irreparable damage. It was no longer seaworthy, and it was decided that it would not be economically viable to attempt to repair it. After the unfortunate incident, Joseph made the decision to leave the Navy and settle in New Zealand. At first he worked on a farm, but he soon gained notoriety for his heavy drinking. He always attributed this to persistent headaches, which he had suffered following an injury that he had incurred after a fall from a ship's mast. Despite his headaches, his problems with alcohol, and his short temper, he found companionship with a lady named Margaret Reardon, a woman whose life was marked by her own hardship and adversity, long before she crossed paths with Mr. Joseph Burns. Married at a young age and living in Australia, she had found herself entangled in a tumultuous relationship that was fraught with difficulties. The strains of marital discord led to her eventual separation from her husband and her emigration to New Zealand, a decision made in pursuit of a better life for herself. After she met Joseph, they settled together in a modest shack in Mechanics Bay that Joseph himself had built. Over the next few years, Margaret gave birth to 2 sons. However, life for the couple was not easy. Joseph was always in and out of work. In 1845, he was working as a stockman, and although he worked hard, He was dismissed following an altercation with his foreman. He was perceived by many in the local community as an unrefined and coarse character, and there seemed to be a general air of caution surrounding him. Consequently, after the incidents, some were hesitant to offer him employment. Eventually, however, he managed to secure work on the North Shore, labouring on the farm of Mr. James Harp. But Joseph never seemed to be far away from trouble, and his time with Mr. Harp was marred by controversy. In early 1847, allegations of theft and the unauthorised slaughter of livestock led to his abrupt dismissal. He and his family were unceremoniously evicted from the farm cottage, leaving them in a very difficult situation. Determined to provide for his loved ones, he took matters into his own hands. Using whatever resources he could gather, he erected a modest dwelling near Shoal Bay. This was an area where European settlers had established brickworks, as well as sawmills, that profited from the logging in the forests of the southern North Shore. But times were tough for Joseph Burns. He intermittently worked, and he only received a meagre income. Fortunately, this was supplemented by vegetables grown and sold by his common-law wife, Margaret Reardon. Despite the adversity they faced and their harsh situation, the couple persevered and tried to provide as best they could for their 2 children. In the early hours of the 22nd of October 1847, the ship HMS Dido was at anchor off the coast of the North Shore. Benjamin Baker, the ship's diligent quartermaster, was on duty when he noticed an unsettling sight, a flicker of flames coming from the direction of the North Shore Naval Base. Without hesitation, he promptly informed his captain, who ordered a team ashore to assess the situation and offer assistance if required. Upon reaching the scene, they were met with a sombre sight: the cottage belonging to Lieutenant Snow, a gentleman who 6 years earlier had been the first signalman appointed to the naval base in Devonport, was ablaze against the night sky. Despite their efforts, the fire proved too fierce to control. The roof was thatched with raupo stalks and had already caved in. Despite at first believing that the occupants of the house had escaped, concern grew as no trace of them could be found. Once the flames subsided, a grim discovery awaited them. Amidst the rubble lay the charred bodies of Lieutenant Snow, his wife, and their daughter Mary, who was 6 years old. Mr. and Mrs. Snow's other daughter was in Auckland, under the care of a lady named Mrs. Cooper. After the formal identification of the bodies, an inquest took place at the Caledonia Hotel. Suspicion soon fell upon Lieutenant Snow's strained relationship with the local Maori community, with reports of prior altercations adding weight to the grim possibility. Testimony from Thomas Duda, who was a signalman at the naval base in Devonport and who had witnessed the fire from a distance, claimed to have also observed 2 Maori canoes in the vicinity, as did Benjamin Baker, who was a quartermaster on duty on the HMS Dido. He said he saw a small boat making its way upriver, with a light like that of a candle or a lantern, heading in the direction of Lieutenant Snow's house. Mr. William Oliver, who resided about a quarter of a mile from the house, told the inquest that he had seen the deceased gentleman the day before the fire. He added that Mr. Snow had had a quarrel with some local Maoris about 18 months or 2 years previous, but had never mentioned anything since, and he himself had not seen anyone suspicious in the area. James Harp recounted how he had seen Lieutenant Snow at Mr. Graham's store 2 weeks prior to his demise. During the inquest, he told how the gentleman had informed him of an incident where he had to chase some Maoris from his garden after discovering that a loaf of bread had been stolen from his kitchen table. William Banks Fagan, who was the surgeon on the ship HMS Dido, gave evidence. He said that although all the bodies were badly burned, he could see on the male that there were 3 wounds on the neck, made by a sharp instrument with considerable force. He added that the edges of these wounds were charred, which proved that the fire was started following the attack. He said that in his opinion, these wounds were sufficient to have caused the death of Lieutenant Snow. Dr. Clifford, the assistant staff surgeon, had also examined the bodies and agreed with Dr. William Banks Fagan. He added that the wounds on the deceased gentleman's arms were probably caused by him trying to ward off the blows from his assailant. The inquest returned a verdict of murder by person or persons unknown. Now the search for truth and justice commenced, amidst the subdued atmosphere that enveloped the North Shore. However, the local Maori leaders found no evidence that this crime had been committed by one of their own, and the investigation into this most terrible crime started to stall. Eventually, Margaret Reardon reached breaking point in her relationship with Joseph Burns. Despite her efforts, his struggles with alcohol persisted, exacerbating their domestic turmoil. Furthermore, his inconsistent employment situation added to an instability to their household. Fearing for her safety and the well-being of their children, Margaret made the difficult decision to leave him. She sought refuge with her sister, Mrs. Sophia Aldwell, who lived in Shortland Crescent. It was there that she hoped to find sanctuary from the life that she had endured with Joseph. In an attempt to prove to Margaret that he could work, Joseph enlisted to sail in the naval steamer HMS Inflexible, embarking on a journey to Australia that departed on the 6th of November 1847. However, his return to Auckland on the 11th of December brought unexpected consequences. In a desperate attempt to salvage his relationship and reconcile with Margaret, on the 28th of December, he visited her at her sister's house and proposed marriage. However, resolute in the decision to leave him, she firmly rejected his proposal. Fueled by a mixture of rage and alcohol, he unleashed a violent attack on her, leaving the poor lady severely injured. Then, consumed by guilt and despair, he attempted to end his own life. However, he was unsuccessful and instead was swiftly apprehended by the authorities and charged for his attack on Margaret. He was tried at the Supreme Court on the 1st of March 1848, and following a short trial and a remarkably brief deliberation of a mere 12 minutes, the jury reached a unanimous verdict, finding him guilty of inflicting grievous bodily harm upon Margaret Reardon. The following day, the judge pronounced his sentence, a lifetime of transportation to Van Diemen's Land, the colonial name for present-day Tasmania, which everyone thought would bring a tragic conclusion to a relationship marred by violence and instability. However, in an unexpected turn of events, Joseph Burns made a curious request for Margaret to visit him with their 2 sons before his impending transportation. Despite her apprehensions, she complied. However, somehow, Mr. Burns managed to manipulate her during their meeting. Under his influence, she found herself coerced into providing false testimony. Both Joseph and Margaret made a confession to the authorities, stating that Thomas Duda and William Oliver, former shipmates of Joseph during his time on the HMS Buffalo, were responsible for the tragic murder of Lieutenant Snow and his family on the 22nd of October 1847. Both men were then arrested. However, during the investigation, it was concluded that they had not been responsible. The magistrate said that the statement from Margaret Reardon must be viewed with a degree of caution, as she was a woman of notoriously bad character, and the fact that Mr. Oliver had replaced Mr. Burns when he was dismissed from his position as a stockman could have resulted in much ill feeling between them. During these proceedings, and while in prison, Joseph again attempted to take his own life, but again he failed. Following this, Margaret Reardon recanted her statements and now blamed Joseph Burns for the crime. She maintained that, driven by desperation for money, he committed the gruesome murders of Naval Lieutenant Robert Snow, his wife and daughter. Allegedly, Mr. Burns sought the £12 in naval pay kept within their home and carried out the brutal act using an axe they had in their house. Joseph Burns, a man awaiting transportation, was now formally charged for the heinous crime of murder, and speculation arose that he had harboured intentions of marrying Margaret and been so distraught when she had refused him, as he was aware that were she his wife, she would be unable to testify against him. However, circumstances had shifted dramatically. Margaret, a woman who had previously been described as someone of a notoriously bad character, now found herself in the unexpected role of the chief prosecution witness. The trial began on Thursday the 1st of June 1848, and Joseph Burns pleaded not guilty. Margaret Reardon had stated that he had left in the early hours of the 22nd of October 1847, armed with a tomahawk and an axe, with the intention of committing this most terrible crime. She had also said that he was disappointed when there was only £12 in the house, and that he had expected to have found considerably more. the prosecution told the court that the tomahawk had since been discovered at the defendant's residence, and an examination had confirmed that it had bloodstains upon it. Margaret Reardon's sister, Mrs. Sophia Aldwell, provided compelling testimony during the trial. She recounted witnessing Joseph Burns' brutal assault on Margaret, vividly recalling his threatening words. She said that he shouted that he would do for her, so she would not tell any tales upon him. This damning evidence shed further light on the volatile nature of Joseph Burns' character and his determination to silence any potential witnesses against him. When the trial ended, the jury was sent out to deliberate, but they returned soon after to find the defendant guilty of the terrible murder of Lieutenant Robert Snow, his wife Hannah, and their 6-year-old daughter Mary. When asked if he had anything to say, the defendant looked at the jury and said, "The best of all things that I am innocent. I am as innocent as a child unborn." The judge, Chief Justice William Martin, then sentenced him to death. As he was being escorted from the court, he carried on proclaiming his innocence. On the 17th of June 1848, following a full confession that also implicated Margaret Reardon, Joseph Burns was escorted from the jail under heavy guard. He was taken across the harbour to the very site of his heinous crime, where, surrounded by a sizable crowd of settlers and Maori, he met his fate at the gallows. His execution marked a significant milestone in New Zealand's history, as he became the first European to be hanged there for a capital crime. In September 1848, Margaret Reardon faced trial for the willful and corrupt perjury related to accusations against Thomas Duda. She pleaded not guilty. In a statement read by Supreme Court Registrar Thomas Outhwaite, Margaret detailed threats she had received from Joseph Burns and appealed for mercy for the sake of her children. The jury, however, swiftly found her guilty, and she was sentenced to transportation to Van Diemen's Land for 7 years. Chief Justice Martin emphasised that no external or internal influences could excuse such a reprehensible crime. Margaret Reardon was transported to Van Diemen's Land on the 23rd of September 1848. Her 2 children were then taken in by her sister, Mrs. Sophie Aldwell, and they went with her to California when she emigrated there in 1849. Hello everyone, and thank you so much for listening. As usual, please leave any comments or feedback you may have, and I hope to see you all again in the next Brief Case.